Hello everyone and good evening. Hope all of you have had a good day today. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Lawrence and I'm part of the scientific advancement team here at Advanced Health. We are a company that provides genetic screening for nutrition and wellness purposes. Joining us today is Dr. Ng Zhi Xiang. He's an expert in molecular biochemistry with a PhD from University of Malaya.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Ng, why don't you introduce more about yourself and about your research and maybe your past achievements?
Okay. Actually, I'm graduated from UM, as you mentioned just now. So that happens in 2012. So soon after I graduate, I joined local private institutions of higher education called Masa University to help them to develop local homegrown degree programs in biomedical science. So soon after 4 years, the program had matured and grant accreditation. So I left, and now I'm assistant professor in another private institutions. So I have more than 10 years of research experience in the health science, and I'm also an academic editor for 9 academic international journals, and also a peer reviewer for more than 20 scientific journals. So currently, I'm also one of the members of the Malaysian Scientific Association.
Mm-hmm.
So my past research is mainly on looking at 3 different areas. So the first one is through by investigating the different effects of the heat treatments on the antioxidants, in particular of the selected plant and vegetables in Malaysia. So that was my very first project, maybe perhaps 10 years ago. And following that, when I pursue my postgraduate, I do start looking at the different risk factors and disease biomarkers, in particular towards diabetes and its complications involving the eye. And during that investigation or during that project, I accidentally developed techniques to screen for the genetic makeups of a particular gene that is involved in the development of the diabetic retinopathy. So my current research still falls inside the human nutrition and health, but now I'm more focusing on the medicinal plant,
Right.
and its therapeutic effects, especially on the different processing methods such as drying or even heating, on the antioxidant and perhaps the anti-diabetic properties of the medicinal plant found locally. So besides, I also look at the different phytochemicals isolated from these plants on the hypoglycemic effects, especially after the digestion process. So, but my ultimate aim is to determine the therapeutic potential of these phytochemicals isolated from the medicinal plant on the cell metabolism and the gene expression as a mechanism to combat human metabolic disease.
Right. Okay, so the title of the webinar today is Genetics and Human Diseases, and without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, Dr. Ng, can you give us some basic introduction to genetics, and maybe for those who have heard of genetics, maybe like a refresher course on what is the DNA?
Actually, DNA stands for Deoxyribonucleic Acid. So it's actually the hereditary materials passed down from parents to the children, including us. So it is very unique because it gives us different characteristics. And since based on this, so we can say that DNA is what makes us. So from the scientific point of view, DNA is information carrying molecules in the forms of double helix. So if you ever wonder how does a double helix look like, you can imagine a ladder being twisted for multiple times. So this DNA is actually made from multiple repeating units called nucleotides. So this nucleotides is made up of 3 parts. First one is the sugar, followed by phosphate, and lastly one of the 4 DNA bases, namely the adenine, thymine, cytosine, or guanine. So it is the sequence of this nucleotide of 3 adjacent organic bases that makes up a codon. So each codon codes for a specific amino acid. So we know that amino acid is a functional unit of the protein. So we know that the DNA can produce different types of proteins.
Right. So it's common knowledge now that that genes are actually responsible for a lot of the characteristics within our body, as well as the variations in our genes. Can you explain more on the relationship between genes and traits?
Okay, traits, or more commonly we call as a phenotype, so usually refers to the any observable physical or biochemical characteristics in the individuals. For examples, the color of your eye, your hair, your height or your weight, or even your blood groups. So all these can be classified as the specific traits of a person. So all these traits are actually expressed mainly through two process. First one is through the transcription, followed by translation. So in transcription, the cells or our cells actually are reading the informations and copy them into a messenger molecule called the mRNA.
mRNA, right.
So for translation, what happens is the information carried by the mRNA will then be grabbed by the cells organelles and then being translated by producing different types of protein through the involvement of different amino acid molecules.
Amino acid, right.
So the different protein being produced from the translations were responsible to give us the different physical characteristics. And therefore, I would say that the gene expression governs large proportions of our phenotype or our trait. So sometimes I felt that the phenotype or the trait not only affected by our genetics, it could also be governed or being modulated by other different factors, such as the environmental factors, the presence of disease, whether there is any injuries in our body, or even our own experience could actually have a certain impacts on our phenotype or traits development. For example, prenatal malnutrition deficiency. So this is actually a very common a disorder or a malnutrition happening in the infant, where the malnutrition conditions actually affects the gene expression and subsequently affects the different protein being produced. And this could actually induce a permanent change in the trait of the baby.
Right. So what happens to traits when there is variation in the DNA?
So genetic variation or genetic susceptibility actually are referring to the differences in our physical appearance, which are caused by a subtle change in our genetic content. So these usually are caused by the mutation process. So what is mutation? So mutation refers to the change in our DNA sequence, whether it's due to a mistakes when the cells are copying the DNA, or due to environmental factors such as the exposure to the ultraviolet light or cigarette smokes, and sometimes even to any radiations. So all these could cause a change in the protein being produced, and therefore it affects the person's appearance or the trait. So in general, in human, there are generally two types of mutation. So the first one is due to the structural variation.
Right.
So structural variation can be caused by a significant change in a particular region of the gene, whether it's due to deletion of a sequence, insertions, or actually copy number variations. But however, today, we are focusing more on another common types of genetic variation, which is the single nucleotide polymorphism. So in short form, we always call it as a SNPs, SNP. So these SNPs actually represents a change in a single DNA basis. So sometimes we do encounter many changes studies in the gene, but however, the most common type is mostly contributed by single nucleotide polymorphism.
Right.
The mutation can be inherited from our parents, especially when they give a positive impact to the offsprings. As for examples, disease called sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is a disorder that is due to a mutation occurring in one of the genes that codes for a protein called hemoglobin, which is found in the red blood cell. So this mutation actually distort the red blood cell shapes and turning them into a sickle-shaped structure. However, these changes gives a benefit to the African population, especially where the malaria is endemic. So this mutation actually protects them against malaria. However, there are certain times that mutation can disrupt the normal cell functions, which cause a human to get to have disease, such as cancer. So cancer is a very common human genetic disorder due to the mutation occurring in the group controlling gene. And sometimes faulty gene causing cancer can happen in the offspring, which resulted them to get early cancer during the early life.
So the word mutation has a very bad reputation among the public, especially here in Malaysia. And they are more commonly associated with negative effects on our body and our health. Is genetic variation really bad?
Actually, many people didn't realize that we actually share 99.5% of our genome similarities with each other, with only the difference contributed by the 0.5%. Although 0.5% doesn't sound a lot, but it still represents millions of differences in the DNA, especially when our total genome is made out of 3 billions of the DNA base pair. So generally, almost all genetic variation happening in the human are biologically insignificant. However, there are certain mutations can be positive, especially when they pose advantage to the ever-changing environment. So this can be linked back to one example that I explained to you just now on the sickle cell anemia, which protects the African population against malaria due to a mutations in the hemoglobin gene. But another examples would be on the mutation that occurs in chemokine protein receptors occurring on the cell surface of the white blood cell. So this one is referring to the CCR5 mutation. So this mutation actually can protect a person from getting AIDS due to the virus not able to enter the white blood cells through this CCR5 mutation.
Right.
So if you ask me whether most genetic mutations are bad or not, I would say not always bad, depending on the situation, because under general circumstances, genetic mutation actually is make us very unique, because each of us are different from each other due to genetic variation. Sometimes genetic variations or mutations is also important for human evolution. Evolution relies on genetic variation, where the favorable characteristics were reserved, passed on from the previous generation to the next generation. So I would say mutation cause genetic variation, and it also gives us some advantage, especially the single nucleotide polymorphism. Because single nucleotide polymorphisms can be inherited from our parents, because we know DNAs are passing down from our parents to the children. So when we match our single nucleotide polymorphisms in our body with another person, so if depending on how much single nucleotide polymorphism can be matched, so it will tell us how far or how close we are to that person.
I see. Okay, so hopefully we've caught up with on the basics of genetics, and let's move on to the main topic of the day. We've spoken a lot about mutation and variation, but how do genes actually affect our susceptibility to these certain diseases?
Actually, based on previous studies, there is the existence of ethnicity variations in the different disease susceptibility. For example, Asian Indians were found to have a higher risk of getting diabetes and cardiovascular diseases, whereas obesity and hypertension were found to be more prevalent among the Malays.
Right, and it was also found that recently our very own Dr. Lee Chongwei was diagnosed with nasopharyngeal cancer, and that was actually found to be more prevalent in the Chinese population,
Yes,
especially
correct.
Han Chinese, and also more prevalent, 3 times more prevalent in men than in women.
Yes. So that is a good example, which I believe most of people are aware of, especially involving our national hero,
celebrity.
so Dr. Lee Chongwei. So come back to whether a genetic variation would expose us to the different disease susceptibility. So we can say that yes, especially the SNPs. The SNPs cause different biological variations among us by generating different recipes of the protein and thus different traits in our body. And this includes our appearance as well as our susceptibility to the different diseases, even until the stage of our response to different drugs. So genetic variation do explain some of our disease susceptibility, especially involving metabolic disease and also our responses to certain drugs. So for example, if a particular set of SNPs in our body were found to be associated with certain traits, so the scientists can actually screen for this gene and those SNPs and also the areas surrounding the SNPs to identify any genes that is associated or responsible for this trait. So this also helps the scientists to find out any biomarkers for the disease or the trait. Besides, the variations in the response to the different drugs also could facilitate the developments of medicine called the personalized medicine. So this personalized medicine is actually based on the concept of genetic testing on or screening on the SNPs of individuals, and this the information collected can be used to select appropriate drugs suitable for that person.
So, can you give us some examples of cases where your genes are responsible for the disease?
Actually, for diseases associated with genetic disorder, usually are classified into two major types. The first type is monogenic disorder. So monogenic disorder involves one gene, because only that single gene that is causing the development of that disease. For example, the sickle cell due to a mutation in the hemoglobin. The other example is the cystic fibrosis. So the other types of the genetic disorder, which is more commonly found in the population, is the polygenic disease. So polygenic disease is contributed by the genetic variants happening in multiple genes. So this is very common for metabolic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, or even hypertension. So take examples for cancer. So there is one gene that is famous since 10 years ago, related to the breast and ovarian cancer development, which we call as a BRCA1, BRCA2. So a variant of the gene for this BRCA1, BRCA2 actually increased 50% chances of the risk of getting this breast and ovarian cancer in a person. So another good example is on the heart disease. So when we talk about heart disease, so there is one gene in my mind which called the cytochrome P40, 1A2. So every one of us carry this gene, and I believe every one of us do drink coffee. Most of us do drink coffee. So inside the coffee, there is one particular compound called caffeine. So this caffeine is actually a central nervous stimulant, and excessive levels of caffeine found in our body is not good for health, because it will pose a risk of having heart disease. So come back to the cytochrome P40 gene that I mentioned just now. So there are actually two variants, the F variants and the A variants, A alleles. So for the F carriers, the person carrying the F alleles are actually classified as slow caffeine metabolizer, whereas the carriers of A alleles are considered as a fast caffeine metabolizer. So for a coffee drinker who carries a F allele,
Yeah.
which is a slow caffeine metabolizer, there are actually considered as a higher risk of having heart disease compared to the normal people carrying the A allele.
So coffee drinkers, you might want to keep in mind of your genes.
So in terms of diabetes, I would say there are more than 65 gene variants currently being detected, being associated with this diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes. So those mutation usually occurs in genes that controls the different blood sugar levels in our body. For example, especially those genes that involve in the productions of the hormones such as insulin and glucagon, or even the glucose transporter that is responsible to transport the sugar from between the different body compartment.
So you mentioned that you've done some research on the complications of diabetes, right?
Yes, that is during my postgraduate.
Yeah. So did you find any genes in there that were actually responsible for the complications to diabetes?
Yes, actually, that time for this project investigating the risk factor and the biomarkers for the diabetes complication called retinopathy. So maybe perhaps I will elaborate more a bit on the diabetes complications, especially before I proceed to retinopathy.
Yeah.
So usually, diabetes people, they are having a higher risk of having multiple health problems apart from the diabetes itself. So long-term diabetes or long-term high blood sugar levels in the diabetic person actually can lead to multiple complications such as the damage in the eye, which we call as a retinopathy, or if it involves damage in the kidney, we call that as a nephropathy. And some people that have malfunctions in the central nervous system, so this complication we classify as a neuropathy. So as for diabetic retinopathy, it is actually a microvascular complications of diabetes involving a blood vessel damage in the light-sensitive tissue at the behind of the eye, which we call the retina. So there were various metabolic theories proposed for the pathogenesis of the diabetic retinopathy. However, the most compelling one is the formations of a special protein called advanced glycation end product. So this advanced glycation end product is actually a protein linked to the sugar found abundantly in the blood of a diabetes patient. So excessive high levels of this age is actually can cause inflammatory process in the diabetic patient through its interaction with a receptor protein called the RAGE. RAGE, R-A-G-E, stands for receptor for advanced glycation end product.
RAGE.
Yeah. So not the anger rage. So this rage actually expression can actually modulate the developments of the diabetic retinopathy. So during my research that time, I was wondering whether the genetic variants inside this receptor could actually alter the sequence or events of the inflammation in the diabetes people. So I do manage to discover that one of the genetic variants in this RAGE, called the 2245A allele, is significantly associated with the diabetic retinopathy patient. So I would say that this can be serve as a potential biomarker, especially in terms of genetic marker for the diabetic patient to help them to screen for any potential developments of diabetic retinopathy.
Wow, that's a lot of diseases that are affected by our genes. I know it might sound scary to a lot of us that some of us are actually born with these predispositions to a certain disease. But I'm sure there are some ways where we can actually detect these genes and these predispositions. Am I right?
Yes.
Could you enlighten us more on that?
Before I proceed to discussing the different tests which we can use to detect this genetic disorder, so perhaps I did explain a bit more on what is genetic predisposition.
Yeah, okay.
So genetic predisposition, or what in other words we call as genetic susceptibility, so refers to the increased likelihood of a person getting or developing a particular disease based on the genetic makeup of the persons. So usually for us to identify whether we are predisposed to a certain genetic disorder, so we can undertake a genetic test. Right.
Okay.
So genetic tests can help us to rule out or confirm to a certain genetic predispositions to a certain disease. So it's actually a medical test to identify any changes in the chromosomes, gene, or even protein.
Okay.
So in general, I briefly explain the procedures of a genetic test. Basically, it involves the collections of small tissue samples. It can be in the forms of blood, saliva, or even your hair samples.
Okay.
All right. So once they're being collected, these tissue samples from individuals, it will be sent to the laboratories to identify any possible changes in the chromosome, gene, or the protein. So the outcomes of the test or the report will then be sent to the clinicians or the genetic counselors of the patients for further advice. So in general, there are many types of genetic screening. So for example, prenatal test. Prenatal test is meant for screening any genetic abnormalities occurring in the fetus. All right. So in terms of infants, so usually we will perform so-called newborn screening. So newborn screening is actually a similar genetic test, but aims to identify any genetic disorder which can be treatable at the early stage of life.
Right.
But for us adults, usually we will go for the pre-symptomatic screening, or what we call as the normal medical genetic screening. So this is to identify any genetic predisposition to the certain disease.
Right. Okay, so let's say you do find yourself in a situation where you are more predisposed to a disease, for example, diabetes. What can we actually do about it?
Actually, most metabolic disease are multifactorial, I would say. What is the meaning of multifactorial? Multifactorial is referring to the disease are contributed by many factors other than the genetic makeup itself. So, for example, lifestyles and environmental factors. So, in particularly the lifestyle. So, although a person's genetic makeup cannot be altered once we are born, so we can actually reduce our risk of getting certain disease through the changes in our lifestyle and environmental factors.
Right.
So lifestyle factors such as diet, in particular, plays a major role in modulating a person in getting a metabolic disease, especially the type 2 diabetes, as the nutrients or the food we took in to our body can affect the gene expression. So this theory is particularly supported by a large-scale studies conducted in the Europe involving people having a higher risk of getting type 2 diabetes. This program is called Diabetes Prevention Program. So the preliminary findings from this program suggest that a modest of weight losing, mainly through lifestyle changes such as diet and also involving certain degrees of physical activity, could actually delay or prevent the development of type 2 diabetes. So when we talk about lifestyle changes, so what are the things that we can do to make us to be further away from this diabetes?
So to decrease the risk
of the disease or metabolic disease is first, maybe perhaps we can start with an exercise program. So how do we start an exercise program is by slowly introducing some physical activities in our daily routine. For example, you can take stairs rather than elevators when you want to climb a building to make yourself exercise.
Yeah.
Or you can park further away from your working places to make yourself walk to the working place. Or even you can take a leisure walk after your lunch. So once you're comfortable with these small little changes, so you can start introducing some lightweight or cardiovascular exercise to your daily life. But I would say you try to aim for 30 minutes of exercise per day for a total of 5 days in a week to achieve 150 minutes of exercise in this exercise program. So in terms of diet, so we know that it's very hard for us to avoid high calories, high carbohydrate when we dine out.
Yeah, especially Malaysians, when we have all those really delicious Malaysian food.
Yes, so it's unresistible.
Yeah.
So for the sake of health, so perhaps we can start our own meal plan, especially healthy meal plan, by cooking our own meal. So you can actually start planning your weekly meal plan by stocking up some groceries, especially involving those healthy foods such as vegetables and whole meals. Right, all this can actually helps you to avoid the high calorie or high carbohydrate food. So I believe every one of us eat snacks.
Yeah.
Right. So including myself.
Yeah.
Sometimes I do try to grab some junk food during my leisure time to avoid any boredom. But instead of the junk food, I would advise most of you to take more healthy snacks, such as vegetables or fruit sticks, or even some biscuits like wholemeal crackers. So if those of you don't prefer crackers or sticks, so you can always go for any small snacks such as nuts or even popcorn. But pay attention to the amount of the salt and the butter in the popcorn.
Ah, I see. Okay.
So I would say all these changes of lifestyle could actually make us more healthy and lessen our risk of getting the certain metabolic disease such as diabetes mellitus.
Wow. Okay. So we've learned a great deal today about genetics and diseases and how important genetics are to us as living human beings. So we've actually had some questions in our comment section. So one of the questions asked was, so by lifestyle modifications in general, how much risk can actually be reduced? Doctor, would you like to?
It depends on these questions is need to be directed to the specific disease. So if in terms of diabetes, so you can modify different lifestyle in terms of physical activity, in terms of diet. So if let's say if you follow the three types of the lifestyle changes that I introduced just now, so based on the diabetes prevention program, based on the findings, they found that there is a 10% increase in the risk of getting the type 2 diabetes mellitus. So the 10% may not sound a lot, but still, if you continue doing this for annually or even every day, so this will actually increase the percentage of reducing the risk of getting the type 2 diabetes.
Decreasing the risk.
Decreasing the risk.
And also, like, this is a question from me. Like, how do you keep track of your progress? Like, do you go for like biometric tests or blood tests to keep track of how you're doing?
For diabetic patients, definitely they need to go back to the hospital to monitor their blood sugars after they were prescribed to certain medication, anti-diabetic medication. For general public or for considered as a healthy people, right? So usually we would try to aim for health screening, at least twice per year, at the beginning and the end. So because a year is 365 days, so if you definitely give some changes in terms of diet that we eat and especially the outcomes. So I would advise go for health screening at least twice a year.
I see. So do we have any more questions? No questions? Okay. Thank you so much for spending your time and to help us educate the public about these diseases and also the genetics behind them. And to the audience, thank you for your attention, and we hope this webinar has enlightened you more about your own body. If you want to learn more about what we do, you can head on to our website at advancedhealth.com. I'm going to leave you with a famous quote that goes, "Your genetics load the gun, but your lifestyle pulls the trigger."